Господин председатель.
President, at the outset, we should like to thank Ms. Nakamitsu, Mr. Blumenthal, and Mr. Bowes for their comprehensive statements, specifically those from the two briefers. Mr. Radchenko, to whom I'd like to say the following. Let's not be hypocritical regarding the rules-based international order. The rules-based international order is not the UN Charter. It's a set of rules thought up by a small number of countries, Western countries, which are being portrayed as universal. So in principle, we don't quite understand, whereas the two briefers spoke to the topic at hand, gave us useful details regarding weapon supplies to Ukraine, the way it's being financed. Mr. Radchenko took us on a historical lecture. He gave us a historical lecture, so we don't understand the reason for that. As we just heard from our briefers, not all of them, of course, threats stemming from Western weapons being supplied to Ukraine are continuing to grow and multiply. As our ex-Western partners continue to make incessant attempts to shift all blame for what's going on in Ukraine onto Russia. Inconsistencies in the narrative they're promoting are clear. Western countries are doggedly trying to make the international community forget that the crisis in Ukraine, just like Western supplies to Kiev, began long before the special military operation. Today, thanks to revelations from a whole host of high-ranking politicians at the time, we know that the planned pumping of Ukraine full of weapons and work to prepare it for war with Russia was going on all these years, concealed by the Minsk Accords, despite the fact that these accords were backed up by concomitant UN Security Council resolutions, although neither the Western countries nor Kiev ever intended to implement them. All the while, civilians in the Donbass were subjected to mass shelling. Russia, of course, could not remain indifferent. Today, Kiev's Western patrons are trying to put a new spin on the state of affairs, saying that they only began to arm Ukraine when the special military operation began in order to repel the so-called Russian aggression. This scheme, over the last 18 months, it's become to something akin to a private military company entitled Ukraine. NATO supplies weapons, mainly using their old stockpiles, financing their military companies on the sly. These companies are making exorbitant profits, whereas the ones fighting and dying by the tens of thousands in the battlefield are Ukrainians. Our briefers already mentioned that Senator Lindsey Graham, when he met with the head of the Kiev regime, called the scheme and the resulting deaths of Russians the best money the US has ever spent in its efforts to help Ukraine. Today, the cumulative amount of military assistance the US and its allies have provided to Ukraine is over $55 billion. The fact that these weapons are being used to shell civilian infrastructure and are resulting in civilian deaths, and there is a great deal of evidence, in fact, to back that up, well, the West is unruffled by this, the so-called peace-loving West. The West is not only pumping the Kiev regime full of weapons in an unbridled fashion, it's also training Ukrainian armed forces and nationalist battalions on their own territory. They're providing intelligence to the Ukrainian army for target setting. They're even approving strikes conducted using Western weapons. And yet they're assiduously asserting that the West is not involved in this conflict. Supposedly, they're neutral. And yet international law, including the provisions of the Hague Conventions dated 1907 and the norms of customary international law, are unequivocal. They prohibit such action by neutral states. Commission of such acts mean that these states will lose their neutral status and will become parties to an armed conflict. As justification, our former partners are putting forward the following argument. They say that the 1907 Hague Convention is supposedly terribly outdated. It's very strange to hear that from states, the military agencies of which are regularly updating and reissuing heavy tomes dedicated to the laws and customs of war. These tomes include lengthy sections about the rights and duties of neutral states, including the norms of these supposedly outdated conventions. Let me underscore, these are not publications containing doctrine. These documents are practical guidelines for army and flotilla commanders, which call for the harshest measures to be taken in response to neutrality being violated, including the use of force. The 1907 Convention international agreements which are in force. They have not been abrogated. Their main objective is to prevent the spread of armed conflicts, to prevent a growing number of states being pulled into such conflicts. Today, these conventions are more relevant than ever. After all, the collective West has proclaimed that its objective is to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia in the battlefield. Their madcap statements are accompanied with irresponsible actions. We're tempted to call this playing with fire, but it's actually worse than that. In their militaristic frenzy, having become completely untethered from reality, the West is deliberately provoking a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. Another argument is based on branding our country as the aggressor, referring to the resolution adopted at the 11th Extraordinary Special Session of the UNGA. The US has started a record number of aggressive wars throughout its history. And yet they're proclaiming that you can help the so-called victim of the aggression without losing your neutral status. Any self-respecting international lawyer will find such arguments laughable. And it's not to do with the fact that the support from the West to these non-consensus documents, which are actually recommendations, vanish into thin air as soon as you become well-versed in the real reasons of the Ukrainian crisis. It's not the fact that the US and its satellites are the architects and main beneficiaries of the situation. In fact, the main problem is that the UN General Assembly is, in principle, not empowered, pursuant to the UN Charter, to determine that an aggression has occurred. Such qualifications are in violation of the provisions of the Charter and are nugatory ab initio. So this label, aggressor, is not a legal qualification. It's in fact a political assessment without any legal foundation. Everything that's been built on this argument, so-called qualified neutrality, all of that crumbles. And if we are talking about value judgment assessments, the aggressor is the one who organized a bloody pro-fascist coup in a neighboring country and turned the resulting state in an enemy of Russia and an enemy of everything that's Russian. History, culture, language, and even the Orthodox faith. The one who trained fighters, including vile neo-Nazi battalions, supplied them with weapons long before February of 2022, knowing that these weapons were going to be used against peace-loving civilians in the Donbass. Also, NATO is trying to portray itself as a strictly a body that exists strictly for self-defense. It sounds like a bad joke given the lengthy track record of unprovoked and unjust military aggressions with the involvement of NATO. What also doesn't hold water is the Western legal doctrine, according to which collective self-defense is being invoked under Article 51. There are two key questions here. We didn't receive a notification here at the Security Council, according to which the Charter, such a notification should be immediate. Thus, it would mean that if you are engaging in self-defense, well, that would be equivalent to acknowledging that you are at war with our country. What's more interesting, references to countermeasures under international law. As you know, these should be commensurate. What sort of damage did Russia do to the US and to the EU to justify the death of our citizens at the hands of Western weapons, and the sabotage, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, or the terrorist attacks against prominent public persons in the Russian Federation? We suggest that the authors of these speculative constructs to ask themselves, what should Russia's response to these countermeasures be? President, today our former partners here at the Security Council are likely going to talk about how they're committed to settling the crisis in Ukraine, and yet the Western countries are promoting a narrative which cannot be squared with the fact that back in the spring of last year in Istanbul, heads of the Ukrainian negotiating delegation actually initialed a peace agreement. This document was publicly demonstrated by the President of the Russian Federation at a recent meeting with African leaders. After the Kiev regime, under pressure from its Western sponsors, went back on these agreements and also introduced a legislative ban on peace talks with Russia, it became clear that a lasting, sustainable peace in our region is not in the interests of Western states. Well, where does that leave us? Agreeing with Russia on peaceful coexistence, becoming neutral, a state which doesn't threaten anybody, a non-aligned state? Well, the Western states didn't allow Ukraine to do that in March of last year. On the contrary, they're arming this country in an insane calculation that it's going to vanquish Russia. Western technology that's been supplied to Kiev is perishing on the battlefield, and in fact, Ukraine has almost run out of Ukrainian and other Soviet equipment. For instance, today, the Prime Minister of Latvia, just before our meeting, said, and here I quote, Ukraine has already been integrated into NATO as far as weapons are concerned. And we cannot but agree, because Ukraine can only fight using the weapons being supplied by the West and by NATO. It has hardly any other weaponry. The head of European diplomacy, Mr. Borrell, the beacon of European diplomacy, Mr. Borrell, today stated that the EU is considering the possibility of turning the European Peace Fund into a Ukrainian defense fund. What we would advise Mr. Borrell, and in fact we've done this in the past, not to stop halfway and to engage in temporary decisions and to rename the European Peace Fund and call it the European War Fund. The Ukraine does not have any of its own weapons left, but there are still some Ukrainians which are being sent into battle like lambs to the slaughter as part of the so-called counteroffensive of the Ukrainian armed forces, which the Ukrainians call the Zaporizhia meat grinder. Kiev can mobilize some more people, yet this is going to soon be the case. This is lamentable. They're running out of space at Ukrainian cemeteries. And this bloodshed, the only people who want it is the West. It was imposed on Ukraine for one reason, so that there can be at least something that they can talk about, some success to report at the upcoming NATO summit in mid-July. There, Western governments will be able to assert that the huge sums being spent in Ukraine are not being spent for nothing. And more weapons will be sent to Ukraine, which again will be destroyed on the battlefield, like the weapons the UAF has right now. The balance of power will not be altered by these supplies, as most independent military experts have already acknowledged publicly that Kiev's defeat is a question of time. And a question of time, of course, is also the number of victims at the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces, which will be sacrificed in vain. Western propaganda peddlers are continuing to promote senseless and empty slogans, saying that Ukraine can win, although they couldn't care less. All they want to do is to weaken Russia. Of course, in our opponent's war chest, they still have high-profile sham terrorist attacks trying to pin the blame on Russia, such as Bucha and the Kavkazskaya GES NPP situation. God forbid a disaster is provoked at the Zaporizhia NPP, which would result in great suffering and the loss of many lives. Today, we disseminated a letter as a UN Security Council document, which once again confirms that against the backdrop of the insane insinuations of the Kiev regime, we do not intend to blow up this NPP. We have no intention of doing so. In our letter, we call on the UN Secretary-General and the international community to influence Kiev, compelling it to abstain from provocations at the Zaporizhia NPP. So that's the situation we have on our hands. Now that the opportunity for peace was squandered, it was squandered back in March of last year. Well, the conditions of peace for Ukraine will, of course, be quite different. By way of conclusion, I'd like to quote one well-respected, highly experienced European leader. Last year, he said basically the following: Ukraine is no longer a sovereign country. They have neither money nor weapons. They can only fight because we in the West are supporting them. End of quote. The only opportunity to save Ukraine, well, this politician sees it as the following, and here I quote: the Americans must begin negotiations with the Russians so as to sign an agreement on a security architecture which would include space for Ukraine. End of quote. There's not much I can say to that. The good thing is that the bitter truth is finally percolating, reaching Western leaders. Ongoing deliveries of Western weapons will not result in the outcome the West wants: to vanquish Russia on the battlefield, inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. We hope our Western colleagues will realize this as soon as possible. Thank you.